The scream cut through the music before anyone even noticed the woman had fallen. Inside the grand hall of Thornwood Manor, hundreds of candles burned bright over silk gowns and polished shoes. Laughter rippled from every corner. Noble ladies leaned close to Duke Alaric Thornwood, each one trying harder than the last to catch his eye. But outside, past the tall garden hedges, an old woman lay on the cold stone path, gasping for breath, her hand pressed against her chest, completely alone. No one inside the hall heard her. No one saw her stumble. The music was too loud, the laughter too bright, and the guests too busy fighting for a single glance from the Duke. Elena Marsh was the only one who noticed she was gone. She had slipped out of the ballroom minutes earlier, tired of the noise and the endless competition for attention that filled every corner of the party. Elena was not like the other women there. She wore a simple pale blue gown, without jewels, without the confident smile that came from knowing she was the center of attention. She had come to the gala because her mother insisted, not because she hoped to win the heart of a duke. She walked along the quiet garden path, breathing in the cool night air, grateful for the silence. That was when she heard it. A faint, broken sound like someone trying to call for help but not having the strength to shout. Elena froze for a moment, her heart pounding. Then she ran. She found the old woman lying near the hedges, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her lips pale, her breathing shallow and fast. The woman's eyes were wide with fear, one hand clutching the front of her dress, the other reaching weakly toward Elena. "Please," the woman whispered, "please help me." Elena dropped to her knees without a second thought. She had seen her own grandmother suffer from a weak heart years ago, and she remembered exactly what to do. She loosened the collar of the woman's dress, careful and quick, and lifted her head gently so she could breathe easier. "I'm here," Elena said, keeping her voice calm even though her hands were trembling. "I'm not going to leave you, just breathe slowly, in and out. You're safe now." The woman's chest rose and fell in short, painful gasps. Elena looked around desperately for anyone who could help, but the garden was empty. The party continued inside, unaware that a woman's life was slipping away just beyond the hedges. "Someone please," Elena called out, but her voice was swallowed by the music drifting from the open windows. She could not wait for help to come, she had to act. Elena remembered the small fountain near the garden entrance. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her gown without hesitation, dipped it into the cool water, and pressed it gently against the woman's forehead. Then she rubbed the woman's hands, trying to keep her warm and calm. "Stay with me," Elena said softly. "Tell me your name. Just talk to me, even if it is hard." The woman's eyes fluttered, struggling to focus on Elena's face. "Margaret," she managed to whisper. "My name is Margaret." "Margaret," Elena repeated, holding her hand firmly. "You are going to be fine, I promise you. Just keep breathing with me." Slowly, painfully, Margaret's breathing began to steady. The tight grip on her chest loosened. Color returned just slightly to her pale cheeks. Elena did not move from her side, not even when her knees ached from kneeling on the hard stone, not even when the night grew colder. A servant, a young man carrying empty trays back toward the kitchen, finally noticed them and rushed over. Elena called to him at once. "Water, please, and something warm." "Hurry." The servant ran off, and within minutes returned with a shawl and a cup of water. Elena helped Margaret take small sips, wrapping the shawl carefully around her shoulders. Slowly, the older woman's strength began to return. "You saved me," Margaret whispered, gripping Elena's hand tightly. "I don't know what would have happened if you had not come." "Anyone would have done the same," Elena said, though she knew that inside the ballroom, dozens of guests had walked right past the garden entrance without a second glance, too consumed by their own ambitions to notice anything beyond the walls of the party. Margaret studied Elena's face carefully, as if trying to memorize every detail. "What is your name, dear?" "Elena. Elena Marsh." "Elena Marsh," Margaret repeated softly, as though testing the sound of it. "I will remember that name." With help, Margaret was able to sit up on a nearby bench. She insisted she felt strong enough to continue, though Elena remained cautious, watching her closely for any sign that the danger had not fully passed. They sat together in silence for a while, the noise of the party a distant hum behind them. "You should be inside," Margaret finally said, glancing toward the glowing windows of the ballroom. "A young woman like you should be enjoying the celebration, not sitting out here with an old stranger." Elena smiled gently. "I would rather be here, making sure you are safe, than in there pretending to care about things that do not matter to me." Margaret's eyes softened at that answer, though there was something else in her expression too, something thoughtful, almost surprised. Not many young women would say something like that. "Not many young women mean it," Elena replied simply. They talked a little longer, though Margaret kept her identity vague, saying only that she had come to see the celebration for herself, dressed plainly so she would not draw attention. Elena did not question this. She had no reason to think the woman was anything more than a guest who had wandered too far from the crowd. When Margaret finally insisted she was strong enough to walk, Elena helped her to her feet slowly, keeping a firm hand on her arm. They walked together toward a quieter side entrance, away from the noise and the crowd, where a carriage waited in the shadows. "Thank you, Elena," Margaret said, her voice full of quiet gratitude. "You have done more for me tonight than you know." "I only did what anyone should do," Elena said again, though something about the way Margaret looked at her made the moment feel heavier than a simple act of kindness. Margaret reached out and gently squeezed Elena's hand one last time before stepping into the carriage. As the wheels rolled away into the darkness, Elena stood alone in the cool night air, watching until the carriage disappeared from sight. She did not know who the woman truly was. She did not know that the frail stranger she had just saved was the mother of the very duke whose attention every woman inside the ballroom was fighting to win. She did not know that this single quiet act, hidden from every watching eye, was about to change the course of her life. Elena smoothed the torn hem of her gown, took a slow breath to steady herself, and walked back toward the ballroom. The music grew louder with every step, the laughter brighter, the crowd more dazzling. No one had noticed she was gone. No one had noticed what she had just done. She slipped back into the party quietly, taking her place near the edge of the room, watching as the noble ladies continued their competition for the Duke's attention. Lady Priscilla laughed a little too loudly at something Alaric said. Lady Constance leaned close, whispering something meant only for him. Elena watched it all with a small, tired smile, feeling strangely distant from the glittering world around her. She thought briefly of the woman named Margaret and hoped she would recover well. Then she pushed the thought aside, believing the moment was over, a small kindness that no one would ever know about. But across the room, though Elena did not notice it, Duke Alaric Thornwood glanced toward the garden entrance with a flicker of concern in his eyes. His mother had told him she wished to observe the celebration quietly, without announcing herself, curious to see the young women being presented as possible matches for her son. She had promised to return before the night grew too late. She had not yet returned, and it had been over an hour. Alaric excused himself from the circle of admiring women with practiced politeness, ignoring the disappointed sighs that followed him, and made his way toward the garden doors. The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped outside, his eyes scanning the dark paths for any sign of his mother. He found nothing but silence, the faint scent of crushed grass near the hedges, and a small, torn strip of pale blue fabric lying forgotten on the stone path. He picked it up slowly, turning it over in his hands, a strange unease settling in his chest. Something had happened here. He could feel it. He did not yet know what. But by morning, the entire manor would be searching for the answer. And Elena Marsh, the quiet young woman in the pale blue gown who had asked for nothing in return, would find her simple act of kindness pulling her into a world she never expected to enter. By the time the carriage carrying Margaret reached the private wing of Thornwood Manor, the sun had not yet risen, but Alaric was already awake, pacing the length of his study with the torn strip of pale blue fabric still clutched in his hand. He had questioned every guard near the garden gates. He had questioned the servants who worked the side entrance. No one had seen his mother leave, and no one could explain the piece of fabric he had found near the hedges. When word finally reached him that his mother's carriage had returned safely, relief flooded through him so strongly that his legs nearly gave out beneath him. He rushed to her private chambers, pushing past the maids who tried to stop him, and found Margaret resting in her bed, pale but breathing steadily, a physician already at her side. "Mother," he said, kneeling beside the bed and taking her hand. "What happened? I searched everywhere for you." Margaret gave him a tired but genuine smile. "I am well, Alaric, truly. It was my heart again, the same trouble the physicians warned me about last winter. It struck suddenly while I was walking in the garden." Alaric's grip on her hand tightened. "You could have died out there, alone. Why did no one help you sooner?" "Someone did help me," Margaret said, her voice growing softer, almost distant, as though she were remembering something precious. "A young woman found me. She did not panic. She did not run for help and leave me alone. She stayed with me the entire time, calming me, keeping me steady until I could breathe again." Alaric leaned forward, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of gratitude and urgency. "Who was she? I need to know her name so I can thank her properly. She may have saved your life." Margaret's eyes grew thoughtful. "She told me her name was Elena Marsh." The name struck something in Alaric's memory, though only faintly. He had seen dozens of guests that night, dozens of hopeful young women presented to him by their families, each one competing fiercely for his attention. He could not recall a face to match the name, only a vague impression of a woman in pale blue standing quietly near the edges of the crowd, never pushing forward, never demanding to be noticed. "She did not ask for anything in return," Margaret continued. "She did not even seem to know who I truly was. She simply saw someone in trouble and chose to help without hesitation, without thinking of what she might gain from it." Alaric sat back slowly, turning the torn strip of fabric over in his fingers once more. He thought of the ballroom, filled with women who had spent the entire evening trying to win his favor with clever words and practiced smiles, each one so focused on capturing his attention that not one of them had noticed his own mother collapsing just beyond the garden doors. "I must find her," he said quietly. "I must thank her." Margaret studied her son's face carefully, noticing something new in his expression, something that had not been there before. "Yes," she said gently, "I believe you should." The physician finished his examination and confirmed what Margaret already suspected. Her heart, weakened by years of quiet strain, needed rest and careful attention. He warned that another episode without immediate help could prove far more dangerous. Alaric listened closely to every word, his jaw tight with concern, grateful beyond, words that his mother had not been left alone in that garden. Later that morning, as the household began to stir, and the last guests from the previous night's celebration departed, Alaric summoned his steward, a steady and discreet man named Harold who had served the family for many years. "I need to find a woman who attended last night's gala," Alaric said, his tone leaving no room for delay. "Her name is Elena Marsh. Find out everything you can about her family and where they reside." Harold raised an eyebrow slightly at the urgency in the Duke's voice, but said nothing beyond a respectful nod. "I will see to it immediately, Your Grace." Word of the Duke's search spread through the manor quickly, and by midday it had reached the ears of the very women who had spent the previous evening competing for his attention. Lady Priscilla, who had been certain her charm had left a lasting impression, heard the news with confusion. "Elena Marsh," she repeated, wrinkling her nose slightly. "I do not even recall seeing her at the gala. She barely spoke to anyone." Lady Constance, standing nearby, folded her arms with a thoughtful frown. "I remember her, the quiet one in the pale blue gown. She left the ballroom early and barely returned before the night ended. What could the Duke possibly want with her?" None of them knew the truth, and for a while the reason behind the Duke's sudden interest remained a mystery whispered from room to room, growing stranger and more exaggerated with every retelling. Meanwhile, at the modest Marsh estate on the quieter side of the city, Elena had no idea that her name was being spoken with such urgency inside the walls of Thornwood Manor. She had returned home the previous night believing her small act of kindness had ended the moment Margaret's carriage disappeared into the darkness. She thought of the encounter only briefly the next morning, hoping the older woman had recovered well, before returning to her usual quiet routine. Her mother, Baroness Marsh, noticed nothing unusual about Alina's mood that morning, though she did comment, not for the first time, on her daughter's lack of enthusiasm for the social opportunities the gala had presented. "You barely spoke to anyone of importance," her mother said with a small sigh over breakfast. "The Duke himself was in attendance, Alina, and you spent half the evening wandering the gardens alone." "I was simply enjoying the fresh air," Alina replied calmly, choosing not to mention the true reason for her absence from the ballroom. She had no interest in explaining herself, and she certainly had no idea that the woman she had helped was connected to the very Duke her mother wished she had impressed. The rest of the morning passed quietly, filled with the ordinary tasks of managing a modest household. Alina tended to the small garden behind their home, wrote letters to a distant cousin, and helped her mother organize linens that needed mending. She had no expectation that anything about the previous night would follow her into the days ahead. But back at Thornwood Manor, Harold worked efficiently, gathering information from household staff who had helped organize the guest list for the gala. Within hours, he had confirmed the family name, their modest estate on the eastern side of the city, and a brief description that matched the young woman Margaret had described. He brought the information directly to Alaric, who read through it carefully, his expression unreadable. "She comes from a respectable but modest family," Harold explained. "Baroness Marsh and her daughter Alina. They hold no significant title beyond their name, and they attended last night's gala on a standard invitation extended to families of similar standing." Alaric studied the details for a long moment, his thoughts returning again and again to what his mother had said. She did not ask for anything in return. She simply saw someone in trouble and chose to help. "Prepare a carriage," he said finally. "I wish to visit the Marsh estate myself today." Harold hesitated slightly, surprised by the personal nature of the request. It was not common for a duke to visit a family of modest standing in person, especially not without prior arrangement or formal invitation. But something in Alaric's expression told him this was not a request he intended to reconsider. "Of course, Your Grace," Harold said, bowing slightly before hurrying off to make the necessary arrangements. As the carriage was prepared, Alaric returned briefly to his mother's chambers to check on her condition once more. Margaret was resting comfortably, color returning steadily to her cheeks, though the physician had insisted she remain in bed for the rest of the day. "You are going to see her," Margaret said, not as a question but as a quiet observation, a faint smile touching her lips. "I wish to thank her properly," Alaric said, though even to his own ears the explanation felt incomplete. "What she did for you last night deserves more than a passing word of gratitude." Margaret reached out and gently touched her son's arm. "Be careful with her, Alaric. She struck me as someone unaccustomed to attention, especially attention she did not seek. Do not overwhelm her with grand gestures simply because of your position." Alaric nodded slowly, taking his mother's words to heart. He understood, in a way he could not fully explain, that Alina Marsh was unlike the women who had spent the previous night vying for his favor. She had not known who Margaret truly was. She had not calculated what such an act of kindness might bring her. She had simply helped a stranger in need, expecting nothing in return, and that simple truth left a stronger impression on him than any practiced smile or clever compliment ever could. By early afternoon, the carriage bearing the Thornwood crest rolled quietly through the streets toward the eastern side of the city, drawing curious glances from passers-by who recognized the emblem and wondered what business could possibly bring the Duke himself to that quiet neighborhood. At the Marsh estate, Alina was in the garden, kneeling beside a bed of flowers, her sleeves rolled up and her hands lightly dusted with soil, when she heard the sound of carriage wheels approaching the front of the house. She paid it little attention at first, assuming it was simply a passing visitor for her mother, until she heard the sharp intake of breath from the housemaid who had rushed to answer the door. Miss Alina, the maid said breathlessly, appearing at the garden entrance with wide eyes. The Duke of Thornwood is here. He is asking to see you. Alina rose slowly, brushing the soil from her hands, her heart suddenly pounding with confusion. She could think of no reason why the Duke himself would come to their modest home, unless somehow, impossibly, this had something to do with the woman she had helped the night before. She smoothed her simple day dress as best she could and walked toward the front of the house, her mind racing with questions she could not yet answer. As she stepped into the entryway, she saw him standing there, tall and composed, his expression unreadable, holding something small and pale blue between his fingers. It was the torn strip of fabric from her gown. Alina's breath caught in her throat as understanding began to dawn on her, slowly and then all at once. The woman she had helped in the garden. The woman named Margaret, who had thanked her so warmly before disappearing into the night. She had not simply been a stranger wandering the gala. She had been someone far more important than Alina had ever imagined. "Miss Marsh," Alaric said, his voice steady but carrying a warmth she had not expected. "I believe I owe you a debt I can never fully repay." Alina stood frozen for a moment, her mind still catching up with what her eyes were telling her. The woman she had knelt beside in the garden, the frightened stranger she had comforted with quiet words and steady hands, was the mother of the man now standing in her family's modest entryway. She felt her cheeks warm with sudden embarrassment, though she could not quite say why. "Your Grace," she managed finally, dropping into a careful curtsy, though her legs still felt unsteady. "I did not know who she was. I only saw someone who needed help." "That is precisely why I am here," Alaric said. "You did not know, and yet you stayed. You did not ask for her name before you helped her, and you did not ask for anything once you learned who she was, because you never learned it at all. My mother told me everything, Miss Marsh. She told me how you calmed her, how you refused to leave her side, how you thought of nothing but her safety." Alina's mother, Baroness Marsh, appeared behind her daughter at that moment, her expression a mixture of astonishment and barely contained excitement at the sight of the Duke standing in her home. She quickly composed herself and offered a deep, formal curtsy. "Your Grace, this is such an honor," the Baroness said, her voice slightly breathless. "Please come in. Let us offer you refreshment." Alaric accepted the invitation with polite grace, though his eyes remained on Alina as they moved into the modest sitting room. The furniture was simple but well cared for, the kind of home that spoke of quiet dignity rather than grand wealth. He noted the difference immediately, comparing it silently to the lavish estates of the noble families who had spent the previous night competing for his attention, each one eager to remind him of their fortune and standing. They sat together in the small parlor, tea served quickly by the flustered housemaid, and for a while the conversation remained polite and careful, filled with the kind of formalities expected between a duke and a family of modest standing. But slowly, as Alaric asked more about the events of the previous night, the conversation grew warmer and more genuine. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, leaning forward slightly. "My mother's account was brief. She was still recovering when she spoke of it." Alina hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much detail to share, before deciding that honesty was simplest. She described stepping out of the ballroom for fresh air, hearing the faint sound of distress near the hedges, and finding Margaret struggling to breathe on the cold stone path. "I did what I remembered from watching my grandmother years ago," Alina explained. "She suffered from a similar condition before she passed. I knew to keep her calm, to loosen her collar, to make sure she did not try to move too quickly. I sent for water and stayed with her until her breathing steadied." "And you did all of this," Alaric said quietly, "without knowing who she was." "I would have done the same for anyone," Alina said simply. "It did not matter to me who she was. It only mattered that she needed help." Alaric studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, though he said nothing more about it directly. Instead, he asked about the party, about whether she had enjoyed herself before stepping outside, and Alina found herself answering honestly, admitting that she had felt out of place among the other guests, more comfortable in the quiet of the garden than in the noise and competition of the ballroom. I noticed the same thing myself, Alaric admitted, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. Every conversation felt rehearsed. Every compliment felt like a performance meant to impress rather than a genuine thought. Alina's mother, listening closely from across the room, could hardly believe the ease with which her daughter and the Duke were speaking, as though the difference in their stations had quietly disappeared the moment the conversation turned honest. Before he left, Alaric turned to Alina once more, his expression serious. "My mother wishes to thank you herself, once she has recovered enough strength for visitors. Would you be willing to come to Thornwood Manor in a few days' time?" Alina glanced briefly at her mother, whose eyes were wide with barely restrained excitement, before answering carefully. "Of course, Your Grace. I would be honored to see that she has recovered well." Alaric nodded, satisfied, and rose to take his leave. At the door, he paused for a moment, turning back toward Alina with the torn strip of pale blue fabric still held gently in his hand. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, offering it to her. Alina took it carefully, surprised he had kept something so small and insignificant, a simple piece of fabric torn from the hem of her gown in a moment of urgency. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Thank you, Miss Marsh," he replied, his voice softer than before, "for what you did last night. My mother means everything to me. I do not know how to properly express what it means that a stranger cared for her the way you did, without hesitation and without expectation." With that, he departed, the carriage rolling away down the quiet street as curious neighbors peered from behind their curtains, whispering among themselves about the unexpected visit. The moment the door closed, Alina's mother turned to her with an expression of pure astonishment. "Alina, do you understand what has just happened? The Duke of Thornwood in our home, speaking to you as though you were an old friend. This could change everything for our family." Alina shook her head slowly, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of the day's events. "Mother, I only helped someone in need. I did not do it for attention, and I certainly did not expect it to lead to this." "Regardless of your reasons," her mother said, taking Alina's hands in her own, "the Duke himself came to thank you personally. Do you have any idea how many women in this city would give anything for such a moment?" Alina did not answer immediately. She thought instead of the ballroom the previous night, of the noble ladies competing so fiercely for Alaric's attention, each one calculating every word and every smile in hopes of winning his favor. She had done none of that. She had simply acted on instinct, on compassion, without any thought of what it might bring her. And yet, sitting quietly in her modest parlor with the torn fabric still resting in her palm, she could not deny that something had shifted. She thought of the way Alaric had listened to her, truly listened, without the practiced charm she had observed him using with other women the night before. She thought of the genuine concern in his eyes when he spoke of his mother, and the quiet gratitude in his voice when he thanked her. Word of the Duke's visit spread through the city faster than Alina could have anticipated. By the following morning, whispers had already begun circulating among the noble families who had attended the gala, each version of the story growing slightly more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed the Duke had declared his intentions to court Alina immediately. Others insisted it was simply a matter of courtesy, nothing more than a formal thank you that would soon be forgotten. Lady Priscilla, upon hearing the news from her own household staff, felt a sharp sting of disbelief mixed with something uncomfortably close to jealousy. She had spent the entire evening of the gala carefully crafting every word, every laugh, every glance meant to capture the Duke's attention, and yet it was the quiet, unassuming young woman who had barely spoken to anyone that now found herself the subject of his personal visit. "It must be some misunderstanding," Priscilla said dismissively to her closest companion, Lady Constance, as they sat together over afternoon tea. "Alina Marsh has no title of significance, no fortune worth mentioning." Surely the Duke's visit was nothing more than simple courtesy. "Perhaps," Constance replied slowly, though her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. "But courtesy alone does not usually bring a duke to visit a family's home in person. There must be more to the story than we currently understand." Neither of them yet knew the full truth. that Alina had saved the life of the Dowager Duchess herself, a secret that remained known only to a small circle within Thornwood Manor. But the mystery surrounding the sudden and unexpected connection between the Duke and the quiet young woman from the eastern side of the city continued to grow, whispered from parlor to parlor, each retelling adding new layers of speculation and intrigue. Back at Thornwood Manor, Margaret continued her slow recovery, resting in her private chambers while the household staff attended to her every need. Alaric visited her often throughout the following days, and their conversations frequently returned to the subject of Alina Marsh. "She reminds me of myself many years ago," Margaret admitted one evening, as Alaric sat beside her bed reading quietly from a book of poetry she enjoyed. "Before your father's title brought wealth and attention to our family, I understood what it meant to help others without expecting anything in return. It has been a long time since I have met someone who still holds that quality so naturally." Alaric closed the book slowly, considering his mother's words. "She did not even know who you were," he said. "She could have simply called for help and stepped away, allowing someone else to take responsibility. Instead, she stayed, she comforted you, and she never once asked what she might gain from it. That is precisely why her kindness matters so much," Margaret said gently. "True character is revealed in moments when no one is watching, when there is nothing to be gained except the simple satisfaction of doing what is right." Alaric thought of the ballroom filled with noble ladies, each one performing kindness and charm only when it might serve their own ambitions, and found himself comparing every one of them unfavorably to the quiet young woman who had knelt in the dark garden without hesitation, asking for nothing. As the days passed and Margaret's strength slowly returned, she grew increasingly eager to properly thank the woman who had saved her life. She insisted that Alina be invited to the manor, not as a formal guest required to endure the scrutiny of noble society, but as someone she genuinely wished to know better. "Send the invitation," Margaret told her son one morning, sitting up in bed with far more color in her cheeks than she had shown in days. "I wish to meet her properly, without the chaos of a crowded gala surrounding us." Alaric agreed without hesitation, already anticipating the conversation with a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation he could not quite explain. He found himself thinking of Alina far more often than he expected, replaying their conversation in the modest parlor of her family's home, remembering the honesty in her voice and the quiet strength in her manner. He did not yet understand what these growing feelings meant, only that something about Alina Marsh had captured his attention in a way none of the calculated performances from the gala ever had. And as the invitation was prepared and sent toward the eastern side of the city, neither Alina nor Alaric could have predicted just how quickly their quiet, unexpected connection would become the subject of intense curiosity, jealousy, and speculation throughout the entire noble society that surrounded Thornwood Manor. The invitation arrived at the Marsh estate on a bright morning, carried by a footman in Thornwood livery, who bowed formally before handing Alina a sealed letter bearing the ducal crest. Her mother hovered nearby, hardly able to contain her excitement, while Alina broke the seal with careful hands and read the elegant script inside. The letter was written in Margaret's own hand, warm and personal, expressing her heartfelt wish for Alina to visit Thornwood Manor so she might properly thank her for what she had done. There was no mention of formal ceremony, no expectation of performance or display, simply a genuine invitation from one woman to another who had shown her such unexpected kindness. "You must go, of course," her mother said immediately, practically pulling the letter from Alina's hands to read it herself. "This is an incredible honor, Alina. The Dowager Duchess herself wishes to meet you." Alina felt a flutter of nervousness settle in her stomach, though it was mixed with something else, a quiet curiosity about the woman she had helped, and about the household she now found herself unexpectedly connected to. She agreed to attend, and within a few days, a carriage arrived to carry her toward Thornwood Manor. The estate was even grander than Alina had imagined, with sweeping gardens, tall stone towers, and an entrance hall so vast it seemed to swallow the sound of her footsteps as she walked inside. A servant led her through the winding corridors toward Margaret's private sitting room, where the Dowager Duchess waited, seated comfortably near a window that let in warm afternoon light. "Alina," Margaret said warmly, extending her hand as Alina entered the room, "I am so glad you came." Alina curtsied respectfully before taking the offered hand, noting with relief the healthy color that had returned to Margaret's face since their encounter in the garden. "Your Grace, I am glad to see you looking so well." "Please sit with me," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair beside her own. "And you may call me Margaret at least when we are alone like this. I feel we have already shared something far more meaningful than formal titles usually allow." They spoke for a long while, the conversation flowing easily between them, filled with warmth and genuine curiosity rather than the stiff formality Alina had expected. Margaret asked about her family, her interests, her thoughts on the world beyond the walls of noble society, and Alina found herself answering honestly, more at ease than she had felt during any moment of the gala itself. "You have a gift for putting others at ease," Margaret observed at one point, studying Alina with quiet interest. "It is a rare quality, especially among the young women I have met in recent years." "I simply try to listen," Alina said. "I have never found much use for performances or clever words meant only to impress." Margaret smiled, a knowing look crossing her face. "That is precisely what makes you so different from the others my son has met." Alina felt her cheeks warm slightly at the implication behind Margaret's words, but chose not to comment further, unsure of what exactly Margaret meant by the observation. Their conversation continued for another hour, touching on subjects ranging from gardening to poetry, until a servant arrived to announce that refreshments had been prepared in the adjoining room. As they moved to join the light meal, Alaric arrived as well, having finished his morning duties managing the estate's affairs. He greeted Alina with a warm smile that seemed far more genuine than the polite expressions he had offered the noble ladies at the gala, and the three of them sat together, sharing a comfortable meal filled with easy conversation. It was during this visit that Alina began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Margaret spoke openly about her fear that evening, admitting how frightened she had been, alone in the dark garden with no one nearby to help. She spoke of how quickly Alina had acted, without hesitation, without panic, simply focused on keeping her calm and safe until help could arrive. "I owe you my life," Margaret said simply, her eyes glistening slightly with unshed tears. "There are no words sufficient to express what that means to me, or to my son." Alina felt a lump form in her throat at the sincerity in Margaret's voice. "I am only glad I was there," she said softly. "I cannot imagine what might have happened if no one had found you in time." Alaric, sitting quietly beside them, watched the exchange with an expression of deep gratitude mixed with something else, something he was only beginning to understand himself. He thought again of the ballroom filled with noble women, each one performing kindness and charm for his benefit, and compared it silently to the genuine compassion Alina had shown without any expectation of reward or recognition. Before Alina departed that afternoon, Margaret took her hands warmly and made her promise to visit again soon, not as a formal guest bound by obligation, but as a friend welcome to return whenever she wished. Alina agreed, touched by the sincerity of the invitation, and returned home that evening with her heart lighter than it had been in a long while. But as word of her repeated visits to Thornwood Manor spread through the city, the noble society that had once barely noticed her began to take a very different kind of interest in Alina Marsh. Lady Priscilla heard the news first, delivered by an eager household maid who had learned it from a servant working at the manor. "She has visited Thornwood Manor twice now," the maid reported. "Once at the Duke's personal request, and again at the invitation of the Dowager Duchess herself." Priscilla set down her teacup with more force than necessary, her expression tightening with barely concealed frustration. "Twice! What could a woman of such modest standing possibly offer that would interest the Duke's own mother?" Lady Constance, seated across from her, exchanged a knowing glance with another guest present that afternoon, a young noblewoman named Lady Beatrice, who had also attended the original gala. "Perhaps there is more to this than simple courtesy," Constance suggested carefully. "Perhaps the Duke has taken a genuine interest in her." The idea, once spoken aloud, spread through the room like a spark catching dry kindling. Within days, the story had transformed into full-blown gossip, whispered from parlor to parlor, each retelling adding new details and speculation. Some claimed Alina had somehow manipulated her way into the Dowager Duchess's favor through calculated flattery. Others insisted she must have used some clever scheme to arrange her presence in the garden that night, knowing exactly who Margaret was, and positioning herself deliberately to gain the Duke's attention. None of it was true, but truth mattered little among noble society when a compelling story offered far more entertainment than the simple facts. Alina remained largely unaware of the growing rumors at first, continuing her quiet visits to Thornwood Manor, growing closer to Margaret with each conversation, and finding herself, almost without realizing it, growing closer to Alaric as well. Their conversations during her visits often extended beyond simple pleasantries, touching on deeper subjects, shared interests, and quiet observations about the world around them that neither had felt comfortable discussing with others. "You see the world so clearly," Alaric told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the manor's expansive gardens while Margaret rested indoors. "Most people I meet are so focused on appearances, on what others think of them, that they lose sight of what actually matters. Perhaps that is simply because I have never had much reason to worry about appearances," Alina replied with a small, honest laugh. "My family holds a modest title at best. I have never been expected to compete for anyone's attention, so I suppose I never learned how. I find that far more admirable than any of the performances I witnessed at the gala," Alaric said quietly, his tone carrying a weight that made Alina's heart flutter unexpectedly. They continued their walk in comfortable silence for a while, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. Alina found herself increasingly drawn to Alaric's company, not because of his title or his wealth, but because of the genuine curiosity and respect he showed her, so different from the polite indifference she had expected from someone of his standing. It was during this same walk that a servant approached with an urgent message, interrupting their conversation. A group of noble families had arrived unexpectedly at the manor, requesting an audience with the Duke regarding upcoming social arrangements. Among them, unsurprisingly, was Lady Priscilla, eager to see for herself the truth behind the rumors that had consumed noble society in recent days. Alaric excused himself reluctantly, promising to return as soon as his duties allowed, leaving Alina to wander the gardens alone for a while before Margaret's maid arrived to escort her back inside for tea. As Alina passed through the main hall on her way to rejoin Margaret, she found herself face to face with Lady Priscilla, who had positioned herself deliberately near the entrance, clearly hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman causing such a stir within noble circles. "Miss Marsh," Priscilla said, her voice sweet but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath the polite tone. "How fortunate to see you here again. Word has spread quite quickly of your frequent visits to Thornwood Manor." Alina, sensing the tension beneath Priscilla's words, chose to respond with calm honesty rather than defensiveness. "The Dowager Duchess has been kind enough to invite me. I am simply glad to see her recovering so well." "How admirable," Priscilla said, though her tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. "It must be quite a remarkable coincidence, finding yourself in the right place at the right moment to earn such favor from the Duke's own family." Alina felt a small flicker of frustration at the implication behind Priscilla's words, but kept her composure, refusing to let the veiled accusation provoke her into an argument. "It was no coincidence, my lady. I simply saw someone in need of help, and did what I believed was right." Priscilla's smile tightened slightly, clearly unconvinced, but before she could offer a sharper response, Margaret's maid arrived to escort Alina away, leaving the tense exchange unresolved. Alina walked away with her composure intact, though the encounter left a lingering unease in her chest, a quiet warning that her growing connection to the Thornwood family would not go unnoticed or unchallenged by those who felt they deserved the Duke's attention far more than she did. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder and more pointed. What had begun as simple curiosity twisted, slowly and deliberately, into something far more damaging. Lady Priscilla, still stinging from her failed attempts to secure the Duke's attention during the gala, began speaking more openly among her circle of friends, planting seeds of doubt that she knew would spread quickly through noble society. "It seems rather convenient, does it not?" she remarked one afternoon to a small gathering of noblewomen enjoying tea in her family's parlor, "that a woman of such modest standing happened to be alone in the garden at the exact moment the Dowager Duchess required assistance. Alone, with no witnesses, and no one to confirm her version of events." "Are you suggesting she planned it?" asked one of the younger women present, her eyes widening at the implication. "I am suggesting nothing," Priscilla said, though her tone made clear she was suggesting exactly that. "I am simply pointing out how remarkably fortunate the timing was for someone with so little to offer otherwise." The rumor spread quickly from that single conversation, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By the end of the week, some versions of the story claimed Alina had somehow learned of the Dowager Duchess's plans to attend the gala in disguise and had deliberately positioned herself in the garden, waiting for the perfect opportunity to win favor through a staged act of heroism. Others suggested she had bribed a servant to inform her of Margaret's location, or that she had somehow caused the episode herself in order to appear as the rescuer. None of these claims held any truth, but truth had little power against a story that offered noble society something far more entertaining than the simple reality of a kind stranger helping someone in need. Alina first became aware of the rumors during a visit to a small shop near her family's estate, where she overheard two women discussing the situation in hushed but excited tones, unaware that the very subject of their conversation stood only a few feet away, examining a shelf of ribbons. "I heard she followed the Duke's mother deliberately," one woman whispered, "waited for the perfect moment to make herself appear indispensable." "How calculating," the other replied, shaking her head. "And to think, everyone believed it was simply an act of kindness." Alina felt her stomach twist painfully as she listened, her cheeks burning with a mixture of humiliation and anger. She left the shop quickly, her purchases forgotten, and returned home in a state of quiet distress that her mother immediately noticed. "What is wrong, Alina?" her mother asked, setting aside her needlework the moment Alina entered the sitting room. Alina hesitated for a moment before explaining what she had overheard, her voice trembling slightly as she recounted the cruel and false accusations being spread throughout the city. Her mother's expression shifted from concern to indignation as she listened. "How dare they suggest such a thing?" her mother said sharply. "You saved that woman's life. You asked for nothing in return. This is nothing more than jealousy dressed up as gossip." "I know that," Alina said quietly, sinking into a nearby chair. "But knowing the truth does not make it easier to hear such things said about me, especially when I have done nothing to deserve it." Her mother reached over and took her hand firmly. "Then you must not let it change who you are. The moment you begin acting differently because of what others say, they win. Continue being exactly who you have always been, and let your actions speak louder than their whispers." Alina took her mother's words to heart, though the sting of the rumors lingered painfully in the days that followed. She continued her visits to Thornwood Manor, determined not to let the gossip alter her behavior, but she could not fully hide the weight it placed on her spirit. Margaret noticed the change almost immediately during Alina's next visit, her sharp eyes catching the subtle shift in Alina's usually calm and open demeanor. "Something troubles you," Margaret observed gently as they sat together in her private sitting room. "You seem distracted today, Alina. Will you tell me what is wrong?" Alina hesitated, unwilling to burden Margaret with something she believed was her own problem to bear. But the older woman's patient, understanding gaze eventually drew the truth from her. She explained, as calmly as she could manage, the rumors that had begun circulating through noble society, the accusations that she had somehow manipulated the entire situation for her own gain. Margaret's expression darkened with quiet anger as she listened, her hands tightening slightly around the edge of her shawl. "This is precisely the kind of cruelty I have witnessed too often within noble circles," she said, her voice firm. "Those who cannot compete honestly resort to tearing others down instead." "I do not know how to make them stop," Elena admitted quietly. "I have done nothing wrong, and yet I feel as though I must constantly defend myself against accusations that should never have existed in the first place." Margaret reached over and took Elena's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her recent illness. "You do not need to defend yourself to anyone, Elena. Not to me, not to my son, and certainly not to those who spread these lies out of jealousy and spite. I know the truth of what happened that night, and I intend to make certain everyone else knows it as well." Elena looked up, surprised by the determination in Margaret's voice. "Your Grace, please, I do not wish to cause any trouble for your family." "You have caused no trouble," Margaret said firmly. "You have shown more integrity in a single evening than most of noble society displays in a lifetime. It is not you who should be ashamed of anything, Elena. It is those who spread lies simply because they cannot accept that kindness alone, without scheming or performance, was enough to earn genuine respect and affection." When Alaric arrived later that afternoon and learned of the rumors circulating about Elena, his reaction was immediate and unmistakably protective. His jaw tightened with barely contained frustration as his mother explained what Elena had endured in recent days. "Who started this?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, though the anger beneath it was clear. "It does not matter who started it," Margaret said calmly, though she suspected, as did Elena, exactly where the rumors had originated. "What matters is how we respond to it." Alaric turned to Elena, his expression softening slightly as he studied her tired but composed face. "I am sorry you have had to endure such treatment because of what you did for my mother. None of this should have touched you." "I do not regret helping her," Elena said firmly. "Whatever people choose to say about me, I know the truth, and so does your mother. That will have to be enough." "It will not have to be enough," Alaric said, his tone carrying a quiet determination that surprised even Elena. "I intend to make certain the truth is known, clearly and publicly, so that no further doubt remains." True to his word, within days Alaric arranged for a formal gathering at Thornwood Manor, inviting many of the same noble families who had attended the original gala, including those most responsible for spreading the damaging rumors. Margaret, though still recovering her full strength, insisted on attending as well, determined to speak openly about what had truly happened that night in the garden. Elena felt a mixture of nervousness and relief as the day of the gathering approached, grateful for the support of the Thornwood family, but anxious about facing the very people who had spread such cruel accusations about her character. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple but elegant gown, and reminded herself of her mother's words, "Let your actions speak louder than their whispers." As guests began arriving at Thornwood Manor that evening, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet anticipation, everyone aware that something significant was about to unfold, though few understood exactly what the Duke and his mother intended to reveal. Lady Priscilla arrived among the first guests, dressed in a striking gown of deep emerald, her confidence intact despite the tension that had been building for days. She glanced around the great hall, searching for Elena among the crowd, curious to see how the young woman would carry herself after enduring weeks of whispered accusations. Lady Constance arrived shortly after, accompanied by Lady Beatrice, both of them exchanging quiet glances as they noted the unusually formal arrangement of the evening. Unlike the sprawling gala from weeks before, this gathering felt smaller, more intimate, with chairs arranged in a wide circle near the center of the hall, as though the evening had been designed for conversation rather than dancing. Elena arrived quietly, escorted by her mother, and took a seat near Margaret as instructed. She could feel the curious eyes of the gathered guests upon her, some sympathetic, most simply curious, and a few, like Priscilla's, sharp with barely concealed hostility. She kept her composure carefully, remembering her mother's advice, refusing to let her nervousness show on her face. Once the guests had settled, and refreshments had been served, Alaric rose from his seat near his mother's side, drawing the attention of the entire room. The soft murmur of conversation faded into silence as everyone turned toward him, sensing that the true purpose of the gathering was about to be revealed. "Thank you all for joining us this evening," Alaric began, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the hall. "I have called you here tonight because I believe it is time to address certain rumors that have been circulating through our community in recent weeks. Rumors that concern a woman who deserves far better than the cruelty she has endured." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room, and Alina felt her cheeks warm as several guests turned to glance at her before quickly looking away. Priscilla's expression remained carefully neutral, though her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her teacup. "Many of you attended the gala held here weeks ago," Alaric continued. "That evening, my mother suffered a sudden and dangerous episode with her heart, alone in the garden, unnoticed by the crowd inside. She very well could have died that night, had it not been for the actions of one guest who happened to step outside for a moment of quiet air." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the room before continuing. "That guest did not know who my mother was. She did not know that helping her would bring any attention, any reward, or any recognition whatsoever. She simply saw a woman in distress and chose to help, staying by her side until she was safe, asking for nothing in return." Margaret rose slowly from her seat beside him, her voice steady despite the lingering weakness in her frame. "I owe my life to Alina Marsh," she said clearly, her eyes sweeping across the gathered guests. "And in the weeks since that night, rather than receiving the gratitude and respect she rightfully deserves, she has instead been subjected to cruel and baseless accusations, whispered behind closed doors by those unwilling to accept a simple truth." The room fell into stunned silence. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly recognizing themselves among those who had participated in spreading the rumors, even if only through careless gossip rather than deliberate malice. "I understand accusations were made," Alaric said, his gaze moving slowly across the room until it settled briefly, deliberately, on Lady Priscilla. "Accusations suggesting Alina somehow planned or manufactured the entire event for her own benefit. I would like to address those accusations directly here tonight, so that no doubt remains among anyone present." Priscilla's composure faltered slightly under the weight of his gaze, though she quickly recovered, forcing a polite smile onto her face. "Your Grace, I am certain no one meant any true harm. Idle conversation often grows exaggerated with retelling. Idle conversation that nearly destroyed the reputation of an innocent woman is not without harm," Alaric replied firmly, his tone leaving no room for further deflection. "Miss Marsh had no knowledge of my mother's identity when she offered her help. She did not linger afterward, hoping for reward or recognition. In fact, she left quietly that night, never mentioning the incident to anyone, and it was only through my own investigation that we discovered what she had done." He turned then to address the room as a whole once more. "I ask each of you to consider this carefully. Among everyone present at that gala, dozens of guests, all gathered within these very walls, my mother lay alone in the garden, struggling to breathe, and not one of you noticed her absence. Not one of you thought to check on her well-being. It was Alina Marsh, a woman most of you barely acknowledged that evening, who alone showed the compassion and attentiveness that true nobility should represent." The weight of his words settled heavily over the gathered guests, several of them lowering their eyes with visible discomfort. Margaret continued where her son left off, her voice softer now but no less firm. "I have lived among noble society my entire life," she said. "I have witnessed countless displays of charm and calculated kindness, offered only when there was something to be gained. What Alina showed me that night was different. It was genuine. It asked for nothing. And it is precisely that quality, so rare among those who compete endlessly for status and attention, that I wish for all of you to recognize and respect." Alina, sitting quietly throughout the entire exchange, felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, moved deeply by the unwavering support Margaret and Alaric had shown her. She had not expected such a public defense, had not even known it was being planned, and the sincerity behind their words touched her more than she could easily express. Lady Priscilla, sensing the shift in the room's sentiment turning firmly against her, attempted one final effort to salvage her position. "Your Grace, I never intended any true malice. Perhaps I simply misunderstood the situation." "Then I trust you will help correct the misunderstanding," Alaric said evenly, "by making clear to anyone who repeats these false accusations that they carry no truth whatsoever." Priscilla had little choice but to agree, offering a stiff nod before falling silent, her earlier confidence thoroughly deflated. Lady Constance, watching the exchange with quiet reflection, found herself reconsidering her own role in spreading the rumors, feeling a genuine pang of guilt as she glanced toward Alina's composed but visibly emotional expression. As the formal portion of the evening concluded, several guests approached Alina directly, offering quiet apologies for their part in the gossip, some more sincere than others. Alina accepted each apology graciously, though she remained careful not to let the sudden shift in public opinion change her own quiet, humble nature. Later that evening, as the gathering began to disperse and guests slowly made their way toward their waiting carriages, Alaric found a private moment to speak with Alina near the edge of the garden, the very same garden where their unexpected connection had first begun. "I hope tonight helped put an end to the rumors," he said quietly, studying her face carefully in the soft glow of the lanterns lining the garden path. "It meant more to me than you know," Alina admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I did not expect either of you to defend me so publicly. I only wished for the whispers to fade quietly on their own." "Some things deserve more than a quiet fading," Alaric said, his voice softer now, more personal than the formal tone he had used inside. "What you did for my mother, and the grace with which you endured these past weeks despite such cruel treatment, deserves to be known clearly and without doubt." Alina looked up at him, the lantern light catching the sincerity in his expression, and felt something warm settle in her chest, something she had been carefully avoiding acknowledging in the weeks since their first meeting. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to find any words adequate enough to express the depth of her gratitude. Alaric reached out gently, taking her hand in his own, a gesture far more intimate than anything he had offered any of the noble ladies who had once competed so fiercely for his attention. "It is I who should be thanking you, Alina, not only for saving my mother's life, but for showing me what genuine character truly looks like, in a world where so few seem to possess it." They stood together quietly in the garden for a long moment, the noise of departing guests fading into the distance, the truth of their growing connection finally spoken plainly between them, no longer hidden beneath careful formality or cautious restraint. In the weeks that followed the gathering, life in noble society settled into a new rhythm, one in which Alina's name was no longer whispered with suspicion, but instead spoken with genuine respect. The rumors that Priscilla had once spread so eagerly withered under the weight of Margaret's public defense and Alaric's clear devotion. And slowly, the same women who had once questioned Alina's motives began seeking her company instead, hoping to associate themselves with someone who had earned such favor within the Thornwood household. Alina found this sudden shift in attitude somewhat uncomfortable, uncertain how to respond to the very people who had once treated her with such cold suspicion, now offering warm smiles and friendly invitations. She remained cautious, remembering her mother's advice to stay true to herself regardless of how others behaved around her, and she continued visiting Margaret regularly, their friendship deepening with each conversation. Margaret, delighted by Alina's continued presence, began treating her almost as a daughter, sharing stories of her own youth, offering gentle guidance on matters both practical and personal, and encouraging Alina to trust her own instincts rather than the expectations placed upon her by noble society. "You have a gift for seeing people clearly," Margaret told her one afternoon, as they sat together in the manor's private library, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books collected over generations. Most people within our circles learn early to see only status and advantage. You see character instead, and that is far more valuable, though far too rare. I learned it from my grandmother, Elena admitted, tracing her fingers along the spine of a nearby book. She always said that true wealth was measured by the quality of one's heart, not the size of one's estate. A wise woman, Margaret said with a fond smile. I would have liked to know her. Their friendship continued to deepen through quiet afternoons filled with conversation, shared meals, and gentle laughter, and Elena found herself growing more comfortable within the walls of Thornwood Manor with each passing visit. She no longer felt like an outsider stepping cautiously into an unfamiliar world, but rather like someone slowly finding her place within a family that had welcomed her with genuine warmth. Alaric, meanwhile, found his own feelings for Elena growing steadily stronger, though he remained careful not to rush the connection developing between them. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, how much scrutiny and unwanted attention any public declaration might bring, and he wished to protect Elena from further hardship rather than expose her to additional gossip before she felt ready. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, built through shared walks in the garden, quiet conversations over tea, and small moments of genuine connection that meant far more to both of them than any grand romantic gesture could have offered. Alaric found himself sharing thoughts and concerns with Elena that he had never voiced to anyone else, trusting her honesty and her lack of interest in flattery or manipulation. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from me, he admitted one evening, as they walked together along the manor's garden paths beneath a sky scattered with stars. Status, wealth, influence, marriage arrangements meant to benefit their own families rather than any genuine affection. You are the first person I have met who seems to want nothing from me at all, beyond simple honesty and friendship. Elena considered his words carefully before responding. Perhaps that is because I never expected to be part of your world in the first place. I did not attend that gala hoping to win your favor, Alaric. I attended because my mother insisted, and I found myself far more comfortable in the quiet of the garden than in the noise of the ballroom. And yet here we are, Alaric said softly, a small smile touching his lips, walking through that very garden together months later. Life has a strange way of leading us exactly where we are meant to be, Elena replied, smiling back at him. Their bond continued to strengthen through the passing weeks, and Margaret watched the growing connection between her son and Elena with quiet satisfaction, pleased to see genuine affection blossoming where calculated ambition had once dominated every interaction within noble society. She made a point of including Elena in family gatherings, small dinners, and quiet afternoons, treating her not as a potential match to be evaluated, but as someone whose presence she genuinely valued. Not everyone within noble society accepted this shift gracefully, however. While Priscilla had been forced into a public retreat following the confrontation at Thornwood Manor, her resentment toward Elena had not entirely faded, merely transformed into a quieter, more careful form of hostility that occasionally surfaced during social gatherings both women attended. At a smaller dinner party hosted by another noble family several weeks later, Priscilla found herself seated near Elena once more, and the tension between them remained palpable despite the polite surface conversation exchanged throughout the evening. As dinner concluded and guests began mingling in the drawing room, Priscilla approached Elena directly, her expression carefully composed but her words carrying a familiar sharp edge. "You have done quite well for yourself, Miss Marsh," she said, her voice pitched low enough that only Elena could hear. A modest family elevated so quickly through nothing more than fortunate timing. Elena met her gaze steadily, refusing to be provoked into an unkind response. "I did not seek elevation, my lady. I sought only to help someone in need. Whatever has followed since then was never my intention." "Perhaps not," Priscilla said, her smile thin and unconvincing. "But intentions matter little when the outcome benefits you so thoroughly regardless." "I understand you are still upset about what happened at the manor," Alina said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate care. "I did not ask for that confrontation, Priscilla. I would have been content to let the rumors fade quietly, without any public reckoning at all. It was the Duke and his mother who chose to address it so directly, because they believed the truth deserved to be known." Priscilla's composure flickered slightly at Alina's calm, measured response, clearly having expected either defensive anger or timid apology rather than steady honesty. "You speak as though you bear no responsibility for the situation you have found yourself in." "I bear responsibility for helping a woman in distress," Alina said firmly, though her tone remained gentle rather than harsh. "I bear no responsibility for the rumors others chose to spread, or for the resentment that followed. Those choices belonged entirely to the people who made them." For a long moment, Priscilla said nothing, clearly struggling to find a response that could counter Alina's steady composure. Finally, something in her expression shifted, a flicker of grudging respect breaking through her carefully maintained hostility. "You are more resilient than I gave you credit for," Priscilla admitted quietly, her tone losing some of its earlier sharpness. "I suppose that resilience is precisely what earned you such favor within the Thornwood household." Alina offered a small, genuine smile, sensing perhaps the first true moment of honesty between them since their initial encounter weeks before. "I hold no ill will toward you, Priscilla. I understand that competition and disappointment can bring out difficult feelings in anyone. I only hope that in time, we might move beyond it." Priscilla did not offer any immediate reconciliation, but she nodded slowly, something in her posture softening slightly as she turned away to rejoin the other guests. It was not a complete resolution, but it marked a quiet shift, a small crack in the wall of resentment that had defined their relationship since that fateful gala months before. As the evening drew to a close and Alina made her way toward the waiting carriage that would carry her home, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that quiet moment in the garden when she first knelt beside a frightened stranger, offering help without any expectation of reward. She thought of the friendships she had formed, the resilience she had discovered within herself, and the growing bond she shared with both Margaret and Alaric, a bond built not on calculated ambition, but on genuine trust and mutual respect. She did not yet know what the future held, whether the quiet affection developing between herself and Alaric would grow into something more permanent, or whether noble society would ever fully accept a woman of such modest standing into their carefully guarded circles. But she knew, with a certainty that settled comfortably in her heart, that she would not change who she was to fit into a world built on performance and competition. She would remain exactly as she had always been, kind and honest, regardless of the challenges that path might continue to bring. Autumn settled over the city with its familiar mix of golden light and cool evening air, and Thornwood Manor prepared once again for a grand celebration, this time to mark the anniversary of Margaret's recovery, and quietly whispered among the household staff, something far more significant that the Duke intended to announce. Alina, invited weeks in advance, spent the morning of the event with her mother, who fussed over every detail of her gown with a mixture of pride and lingering disbelief at how far her daughter's quiet act of kindness had carried her. "You look beautiful," her mother said, adjusting a small ornament in Alina's hair with careful hands. "Though I suspect it will not be the gown that draws the Duke's attention tonight." Alina smiled softly, though nervousness fluttered in her chest as she thought about the evening ahead. In the months since the confrontation at Thornwood Manor, her relationship with Alaric had grown steadily, built on quiet conversations, shared laughter, and a deepening trust that neither of them had expected to find within the competitive, calculating world of noble society. She had grown close to Margaret as well, treasuring their friendship as much as any bond she shared with her own family. The carriage arrived promptly, and Alina traveled once more toward the grand estate that had become such an unexpected and meaningful part of her life. As she stepped through the familiar entrance hall, she felt none of the anxious uncertainty that had gripped her during her very first visit months before. This place no longer felt foreign or intimidating. It felt, in ways she had never anticipated, like a second home. The great hall glittered with candlelight and soft music, though the atmosphere felt warmer and less rigidly formal than the gala where everything had first begun. Margaret greeted her warmly near the entrance, embracing her with genuine affection rather than the polite formality reserved for distant acquaintances. "Tonight is a special evening," Margaret said, her eyes sparkling with quiet anticipation. "I am so glad you are here to share it with us." Alina moved through the gathering, exchanging pleasant conversation with guests who greeted her with far more warmth than she had ever expected to receive within these circles. Even Lady Priscilla, present among the crowd, offered a polite and surprisingly sincere greeting, the earlier hostility between them having faded into a quiet, respectful distance that both women seemed content to maintain. As the evening progressed, Alaric found Alina near the edge of the hall, drawing her gently toward a quieter corner away from the bustling crowd. His expression carried a nervous energy she had rarely seen from him, a stark contrast to the composed, confident manner he typically displayed in public settings. "I have something I wish to speak with you about," he said, his voice slightly unsteady despite his obvious effort to remain calm. "You seem nervous," Alina observed gently, studying his face with quiet curiosity. "I suppose I am," he admitted, a small, self-conscious smile crossing his features. "Which feels rather absurd, considering everything we have already shared together these past months." He reached for her hand, holding it carefully within his own, and Alina felt her heart quicken as she sensed the significance of the moment building between them. "Alina, since the night I found you kneeling beside my mother in that garden, my life has changed in ways I never anticipated. I have watched you endure cruelty with grace, offer kindness without expectation, and remain true to yourself despite every pressure surrounding you to become someone else entirely." Alina listened quietly, her breath catching as his words continued, sincere and unhurried. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people competing for my attention, my favor, my title," Alaric continued. "You never competed for any of it. You simply were yourself, honest and compassionate, and in doing so, you captured something within me that no calculated performance ever could." He knelt slowly before her, drawing a small velvet box from within his coat, and Alina felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as understanding settled over her. "Alina Marsh," Alaric said, his voice steady now, filled with quiet certainty. "I do not offer you this because of what you did for my mother, though I will forever be grateful for it. I offer you this because of who you are, someone genuine in a world built on performance, someone kind without expectation of reward. Will you marry me?" The surrounding guests, many of whom had gradually noticed the moment unfolding, fell into hushed silence, watching as Alina, overwhelmed with emotion, nodded through her tears. "Yes," she said softly, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, Alaric, I will." A quiet cheer rippled through the gathered crowd as Alaric rose and gently placed the ring upon her finger, before drawing her into a warm, tender embrace. Margaret, watching from nearby with tears of her own gathering in her eyes, felt a deep and profound gratitude settle over her, not only for the life Alina had saved months before, but for the genuine happiness she had brought into her son's life since that fateful night. News of the engagement spread quickly through noble society, though this time, the story carried none of the earlier suspicion or resentment that had once surrounded Alina's connection to the Thornwood family. Instead, it became a story told with genuine admiration, a reminder that character and kindness could triumph over calculated ambition, and that true worth was never measured by title or fortune, but by the quality of one's heart. Lady Priscilla, upon hearing the news, found herself surprised by the absence of any lingering jealousy within her own heart. Instead, she felt something closer to quiet respect, an acknowledgement that Alina had earned her place within the Thornwood family through genuine merit rather than manipulation or scheming, exactly as she had claimed from the very beginning. The wedding, held the following spring within the same gardens where Alina had first knelt beside a frightened stranger, brought together noble families from across the city, many of whom had once doubted Alina's intentions, but now celebrated the union with genuine warmth and admiration. Margaret stood proudly beside her son throughout the ceremony, her health fully restored, her heart filled with gratitude for the young woman who had saved her life, and in doing so, had brought unexpected joy into her family's world. As Alina and Alaric exchanged their vows beneath a canopy of blooming flowers, surrounded by the very gardens that had witnessed both tragedy and triumph, Alina thought back to that quiet, frightened night months before, when she had simply seen a stranger in need and chosen, without hesitation, to help. She had never imagined that single act of compassion would lead her here, standing before everyone she loved, bound forever to a man who valued her honesty and kindness above every calculated performance noble society had ever demanded. The ladies who had once fought so fiercely for Alaric's attention during that fateful gala watched from among the gathered guests, many of them finally understanding the truth that had eluded them for so long. The Duke's heart had never been a prize to be won through clever words or practiced charm. It had been earned quietly, genuinely, by someone who never sought it at all, someone who simply chose kindness in a moment when kindness seemed to matter least, and discovered in the end that it mattered more than anything else in the world. As the sun set gently over Thornwood Manor that evening, casting warm golden light across the gathered crowd, Alina and Alaric shared their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by family, friends, and the quiet garden that had brought them together in the first place. And somewhere among the joyful crowd, Margaret watched with tears of happiness in her eyes, grateful beyond words for the stranger who had once knelt beside her in the darkness, and who now stood before her as the daughter she had always wished to have. A year passed quietly and happily at Thornwood Manor, and Alina settled into her new life with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She had feared in the earliest days of her marriage that the weight of her new title might change her, that the constant presence of servants, formal duties, and noble expectations might slowly wear away the simple honesty that had defined her. Instead, she found that her position gave her something she had never expected, the ability to help far more people than she ever could have on her own. She began spending her mornings visiting the poorer districts on the edges of the city, bringing food, medicine, and warm clothing to families struggling through the harsh winter months. At first, she traveled quietly, without announcement, much as she had once wandered away from the noise of the gala in search of simple peace. But word of her visits spread quickly among the grateful families she helped, and soon others within noble society, inspired by her example, began joining her efforts. Lady Constance was among the first to ask if she might accompany Alina on one of her visits, curious to understand what drew the new Duchess away from the comfort of the manor so frequently. She arrived expecting a brief, ceremonial gesture, the kind of charitable visit noble families often performed for appearances alone. Instead, she found Alina kneeling in a small, modest home, carefully bandaging the injured hand of an elderly craftsman, speaking with him gently about his family and his worries, listening as though his troubles mattered as much as any concern within the grand halls of Thornwood Manor. "You do this often?" Constance asked afterward, as they walked together back toward the waiting carriage. "As often as I am able," Alina replied simply. "I remember what it felt like to be overlooked, to matter little to those who held far more power and comfort than I did. I do not wish anyone else to feel forgotten if I can help it." Constance considered her words carefully, remembering with quiet discomfort her own past willingness to believe cruel rumors about a woman she had never truly taken the time to understand. "I am sorry, Alina, for the part I played in doubting you, all those months ago." Alina reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "That is behind us now. What matters is what we choose to do moving forward." Their friendship grew steadily from that day, and Constance became one of Alina's most devoted companions in the charitable work that soon expanded across the entire city, funded generously by the Thornwood estate and organized carefully by Alina herself. Hospitals for the poor were built where none had existed before. Schools opened their doors to children whose families could never have afforded such an opportunity in years past. Alina's quiet compassion, once dismissed as naive or insignificant by noble society, had grown into a force reshaping the very foundations of the community around her. Alaric watched his wife's tireless work with quiet pride, often joining her on visits whenever his duties allowed, learning alongside her the true weight of responsibility that came with their positions. He had once believed that leadership meant commanding respect through strength and authority alone. Alina taught him, through her example, that true leadership often meant kneeling beside those in need, listening carefully, and offering help without expectation of anything in return. Margaret, too, found renewed purpose in her final years, working closely alongside Alina to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting families facing sudden illness, much as she herself had once faced. She often told the story of that frightened night in the garden to anyone willing to listen, not as a tale of misfortune, but as proof that a single act of unexpected kindness could ripple outward, touching countless lives far beyond what anyone could have imagined at the time. "I was simply a frightened old woman on a garden path," Margaret would say, smiling softly whenever she shared the story. But Alina did not see an old woman. She saw someone who needed help, and she gave it freely. That single choice changed everything, not only for me, but for this entire city. As the years passed, Alina and Alaric welcomed their first child, a daughter they named after Margaret, whose health had remained strong and steady since that fateful night so many years before. The little girl grew up surrounded by stories of her grandmother's near tragedy and her mother's quiet courage, learning from an early age that kindness required no audience, no reward, and no recognition to hold true value. Lady Priscilla, whose early jealousy had once driven her to spread such damaging rumors, eventually became an unlikely ally within the charitable efforts Alina had built, finding in the work a genuine purpose that had long been missing from her carefully curated but ultimately hollow pursuit of noble favor. The two women, once fierce rivals, developed a respectful friendship built on mutual admiration for the good they were now able to accomplish together. The gala that had once seemed so significant, filled with noble ladies competing desperately for a single moment of the Duke's attention, faded gradually into a distant memory, remembered mostly as the strange and fortunate beginning of a story that had reshaped an entire community. Few who had attended that night could have predicted that the quiet young woman who slipped away from the crowded ballroom, seeking nothing more than a moment of peace in the garden, would go on to change so many lives simply by choosing, in a single ordinary moment, to stop and help. Years later, when Alina's own daughter asked her mother why she had left the party that night instead of staying to dance and enjoy herself among the other guests, Alina knelt beside her, much as she once had beside a frightened stranger in a quiet garden, and answered with the same simple honesty that had guided her entire life. "Because someone needed help," she said gently, "and that always matters more than anything else happening around us." Her daughter considered this for a moment before smiling brightly. "Even if no one is watching." "Especially if no one is watching," Alina replied, pulling her close. "That is when kindness means the most." And so the story that began with noble ladies fighting fiercely for a duke's attention, unaware that true worth had already quietly walked past them into the garden, became not simply a tale of romance and unexpected fortune, but a lasting reminder passed down through generations, that genuine kindness, offered freely and without calculation, holds a power far greater than any title, any fortune, or any carefully rehearsed performance ever could.